let me introduce myself. I'm now teaching in the Department of Japanese Studies in Chinese University of Hong Kong. I received my PhD in Japan. I studied in Tohoku University. And maybe you don't know the city Sendai, but I think you all know the city Fukushima. It's just like 50 kilos from Fukushima. So I worked on a PhD about Nishida Kitaro and phenomenology. So my training is like Western philosophy and Japanese philosophy. And I got my first job in Hong Kong in the Department of Philosophy. But I find a little bit alienated because Japanese philosophy is really marginalized in the philosophy department, I think, in the world. So I decided to move to the Japanese studies, Japanese studies program. And I feel I'm marginalized again because they don't really like philosophy. So I'm really at ease here because I think I'm not marginalized here. So today I'm going to talk about philosophy for emperors, some lessons to learn from the Imperial, good morning, guten Morgen, New Year's lectures. I have my full paper with me this morning. Just finished it. So I think we can share the paper later with a Google folder. Maybe I will just read part of it, and later maybe I will just go through some of the key points in my talk. So first I need to thank Takeshi and Pierre to invite me and of us here. Today I think we are going to talk about these important ideas of intercultural entanglement. So what is the concept? In Japanese we have an interesting word, kato, which is from two plants, the Katsura and Fuji. That means two plants, intertwined and tagged together, in a sense that they cannot be separated. But I actually prefer a verb, ai karamu. Means it is not just a static way of bringing together, but it is a kind of action that we cannot see a pure single self. So culturally speaking, we would try to argue, I think today and tomorrow, that there will be no such thing as pure Japanese philosophy or pure Chinese or Korean philosophy. In other words, all these philosophical traditions in East Asia are somehow in a state of kato. It's like mixed together. Since Eric, we will talk about Shinjukyo, Shinjuja, or New Confucianism tomorrow. May I add one remark that I think one of the best examples of this cultural entanglement is Professor Tang Junyi. As you may know, he is a representative figure of this movement, but he had to escape to Hong Kong, unfortunately to Hong Kong. By then it was the British colony in 1949. So I think he must have had a lot of kato as a scholar and as a person. But later in 1960s, precisely speaking, 1967, he was in Japan. Tang Junyi was in Japan for curing his eye disease. And actually at that time he realized that something interesting. He was really trying hard to preserve Chinese culture in Hong Kong, but it was not easy. But to him, to a huge surprise, he witnessed a lot of Chinese culture being preserved very well in Japan, or precisely speaking in Kyoto. So that is the kind of, as a kind of diaspora scholar, Tang actually suggested if China could not preserve their own culture, then Japan could be the leader. So it is not just to keep one culture alive by just boosting up its own vitality, but it is important to see the other to help you to be vitalized. So that is a very good example of this kind of intercultural exchange and intercultural kato, I have to say. But however, I need to make a quick remark that in Japan, there are actually many moves, many attempts to quit China, or in recent terms, Czechs, or even Asiacs. So for Tang Chunyi, okay, Japan is the ideal country to embrace China, but it was at the moment Tang received the news, of what is happening in China, the Cultural Revolution. So he had all his hope in Japan. However, Japan had this long history of trying to escape from China. One perfect example would be this Kokukaku, or in 普通话 国学 movement, but not the Chinese 国学, but the Japanese Edo period Kokukaku movement, led by scholars such as Modori Norinaga. They argue the Chinese heart, the kara kokoro, is poisoning the Japanese Yamato Damashi. And of course, in the modern period, we have Fukuzawa Yukichi, the Yijimanyan guy, who famously suggests a paradigm shift from the wagon Kansai to the wagon Yosai. And perhaps he also have a famous thesis of escaping Asia, the Dazha Long. But however, we all know that these Czechs and Asiaxis projects were not successful because the cultures are somehow entangled. So it is impossible to get rid of the Chinese element easily. So one, again, a good example would be the word tetsugaku. The translator of this word, as you may know, is Nishi Amane. But as a Langaksha, he really tried to escape from this Chinese influence, but he could not. But at least he didn't want to use the word Likaku, suggested by other scholars. Actually, it was a Confucian notion, Lisha, to translate philosophy. So he thought of new terms, again from some Chinese influence, from Zhou Dunyin's insights. So he borrowed this word, Shi Jie, Ki Tet, or Ki Tetsugaku, to translate the term. And later he got rid of the love and add a gaku to emphasize philosophy is something different to kyo, or the religion. I would prefer to translate philosophy as kitetsu. So you can see at the back we have 3 issues of magazine called Kitetsu. I'm the editor. I hope you have a look of what I'm doing. It is related to a project to open up philosophy, not as a gaku, but to bring back the love to wisdom. I'll explain it later. It is actually related to my talk, Takahashi Satomi's lecture to the emperor. We'll get into it later. So what I will try to argue today is that Japan is a perfect example to understand what is going on with this philosophical entanglement. I will focus on one group of philosophers, namely those privileged philosophers who had the chance to give a lecture to the Japanese emperors. I have to say, since we have different scholars here, I would like to make sure that I am not promoting the Imperial, propaganda here. That's why first I would like to quote Sakaguchi Ango, who is not a big fan of the emperor family. He actually argued that the Japanese emperor system is kiwamete nihon teki na seiji teki sakuhin. So it's extremely Japanese kind of, political, mechanism. Or even he used the word karakuri, so it's like a machine, right? Why? Because he quoted one example. As you may know, in the case of Toyotomi Hideyoshi, he took all these daimyo, he took the daimyos and the emperor to a place called the Jurakudai with the purpose of trying to impress the emperor and to gain his own power. So this emperor system is quite easy to be manipulated by all these politicians. So in this sense, it is very Japanese. However, again, since he argued this is a uniquely Japanese, and we have to be consistent, right? So we need to give him some remarks that actually, again, we can see a lot of Chinese elements in the making of the so-called essentially Japanese emperor system. So we have one typical example of this term tenno. So in the past in Japan, the emperors were not called tenno, but maybe daio or a king, right? But later in the 7th century, the Japanese emperor system realized that they should call themselves tenno, tenhuang, because they would like to have a parallel status with the Chinese tens. So until recently, we actually believe that the tenno have a kind of deity status from the heaven. At least we need to worship the tenno. It was until after the war, the year 1946, the first day of the year, the emperor announced that he is actually a human being. And from that time, and later with the new constitution, we have these new ideas of shocho tenno, which means that tenno is nothing but just merely a symbol. Nobody knows actually what the symbol means, but just a symbol of the state and the unity of the people. Well, even though it is shocho tenno, but this year in November, I urge all of us to follow up one important event, namely the Daijosai, Daichang Sai here. There will be a festival that the new emperor will taste the first New Year's harvest and to eat and sleep with the god. So with this a rather religious ritual, we can see that this symbol of Japan is being almost like becoming God again. So no matter the emperor is a god or human being, in Japan, we realized that the emperor needed to be educated. So now we came to this important ritual, another very important ritual of the Kosho Hajime no Gi. According to the Kunaicho, the Imperial Family Office, these ritual starting from the Meiji era, and in January they will invite scholars to give lectures to the emperor. And in the early days, they are divided into three categories: the Japanese text, the Chinese text, and later the so-called the Western text. So in this talk, I would like to, this is the photo of the Kosho Hajime no Gi this year. And this year we have 3 talks delivered by 3 non-philosophers. Actually, we didn't have philosopher talks for almost like 20 years. So this year we have a talk on yokai, so monsters, another talk on corporate governance, and on cancer. So in the past, we have a long traditions of philosophy lectures, and that is the topic for today. And I will. The aim of this talk is like this. I would like to give you some short review of all these philosophy lectures. I call it the philosophy for emperors. But my project is to open up these philosophy texts to become a kind of philosophy for everyone, as you may know, the P4E project. So I would like to bring all these privileged project lectures back to the basic, back to the earth, and should be shared by everyone. And that is the lesson that we would like to learn from. So let's start to go through all these kind of philosophy for the emperors lecture series. As I mentioned, there are 3 categories. First, let's look into the Chinese Kansho. So for the Kansho, we had, this is the list. If you would like to have a look, this is the full list I requested from the Kunaicho, because online only have the Heisei period lectures. So I request the full list and realize that they have a lot of spelling mistakes and incomplete materials from the Kunaicho list, and that's why I'm compiling my own list. I hope to give you a much better list in the back. And so first we can realize that for the first lecture dated 1869, that is the second year of the Meiji period. For the first day of for the very first lecture, the Kosho Hajime no Gi, there are actually 4 lectures: 2 on the Analects, 論語, and 2 on Nihon Shoki. So there are only Japanese texts and Chinese texts. And we don't have all the details of the talks, the lectures. I would like to take it out later. But what I can show you here is the list of all these lectures on the Analects. And you can see from the Meiji period to the Taisho period and to the Showa period, all these Analects lectures are almost like a must for the Japanese emperors. So why the 論語 is so important? We can have one important point here, that is to have a kind of education for the ruler. And how to be a good ruler, that is according to the Lun Yu, I think I have, yeah. Oh, maybe I missed it. Okay. To become a good ruler, it has to be virtuous. And for the rude, for those who are being rude, and they need to be a person also to be a loyal person. So loyalty is actually important for the all this Meiji period. And I think in Lun Yu we have the Wei Zheng, the 2.1, I will quote, a ruler who governs his state by virtue is like the North Polar Star, which remains in its place while all the other stars revolve around it. So that is the kind of teaching that would like to give to the emperors. However, we can ask one important question. What happens if the emperor is not virtuous? Do we have the obligation to be loyal to this emperor? And for the Japanese people, this is not the question. We should not ask this question. This is a taboo. So actually, if you go into this long list of Kosho Hajime no Gi, we will see that two important Chinese texts are missing, namely the Mangzi and the Chunqiu. And you know why? Because Mangzi suggests Men Wei Gui. So it is not the emperor the most important, but the people are the most important. And for the Chunqiu, it is the history of how one dynasty being override by another dynasty. And this is should not be mentioned to the emperor. So first we can learn one important thing. These two books are censored to the emperor, so we need to include it in our P4E projects. So all the thing which is not mentioned in the list, actually we should have a reading. We should promote these kind of books. So and also we go back to the list, we can realize that after 1951, almost more than 70 years ago, all the analog lecture disappeared. So there's not even an analog lecture for the Heisei Akihito emperor. So we may suggest that all these analogs, Lun Yu or the longer traditions, had died out in the middle of 20th century. But it is not the case because there are still other important talks by other prominent scholars. For example, even in the year 1945, that is the year Japan was in the very difficult situation in the Pacific War. There was still a talk by important professors, Yano, on Reo Soncho Suru, Shinano Bunka no Tokushoku ni tsuite. So there will be a talk on the characteristic of Chinese culture in terms of respecting the lead. And later in the 1950s, there are still lectures on, for example, Lu Xun, and also lectures on the essence of Chinese literature. So we can see that the Chinese influence is not finished. And even for the Emperor Akihito, who just abdicated recently, his first taste of Kosho Hajime no Gi in 1991 has actually had a lecture by Professor Yoshida Misukuni from Kyodai. The title of his lecture was Technological Thought in Ancient China. So we all know that the former emperor, he is not a humanity guy, but still the scholar would like to introduce this kind of technological thinking to the emperor. So this is one aspect of what we call the Chinese influence to the Japanese imperial system. And next we can go to the Kakukaku, or the native studies lectures. We called it the Kokusho. So in the first lecture, first two lectures in 1869, there are two lectures on Nihon Shoki. So Nihon Shoki is so-called Japanese, one of the oldest documents on the emperor system and the Japanese myth. But we all know that this text is actually written in Kanbun, in Chinese Asian text. Similar to Manyoshu, we believe that it was just like all written in Manyo Kana. But recently, after Lewa, we all realized that there are some Kanbun Hanwon texts in the Manyoshu as well. So we can see that we have all these kind of Kokukaku kind of lectures to the emperor. I do not have time to go through all of them, but I will give you some important examples. For example, Rajaji's lectures in 1916 on Manyoshu. We also have this. This is supposed to be Mannen, sorry. Where the Mannen, that will be that will be on Kokukaku no Seishin. And one important figure is Rajaji Tetsuro. We all know that if you work on Japanese philosophy, he is one of the most important Japanese philosophers, but he was not giving a talk on Japanese philosophy. He was actually giving a talk on these Kakukaku lectures. And the topic of his lecture is on Shinkei's Lingka. So it's on important Buddhist monk Shinkei. He wrote kind of, I would call it the linked verse, the kind of poems created by more than one poet. So what is going on with this talk? That we'll go into the details later. And third, let's go to the Yosho. Yosho means the Western text, and we can see that there are some important figures who gave a lot of lectures on the Yosho. One of them is Nishimura Shiaki. The other one would be Kato Hiroyuki. Nishi Amane did not deliver a lecture to the emperor, but all these guys are westernized scholars, and they really want to promote Western thought, and they are regarded as liberals because some of their thoughts are rather radical. Nishi Amane promote a radical kind of reception of Western culture. Kato and Nishimura actually suggests that Japanese people should not use Japanese, but use more, Western language. So, Gaku, or this kind of, Western thinking, is like having a strong, not only academic significance, but they also have a lot of political implications. And as you can see, the contents of this talk, I would take Nishimura as an example. They have a lot of topics on constitutions and laws. So that is the kind of lectures that the emperor actually were interested. And Nishimura actually received a lot of criticism. For example, from Fukushima Yuichi, because Fukushima thinks this group of people who are forming a magazine group called the Meiroku magazine, they are a kind of illegal because the academics should not promote such kind of strongly political message. And Nishimura actually wrote an article to respond to Fukuzawa, but I will skip that for now. So up to now we can see the Confucian scholars, the Kakukaku scholars, and the Yogaku scholars. But we may ask, where are the Japanese philosophers? So this is the list of all the so-called Japanese philosophers who actually delivered talks to the emperor. So we have Nishida Kitaro, the first Japanese philosopher, delivered a talk on January, it's all January, January 1941, and then Rajaji, 43. These are the two talks delivered during the Pacific War. And after the war, we have a couple of scholars who are somehow unknown even to the academia in Japan. Most of them did not know that they delivered a talk to the emperor. Of course, they are famous people, but not many of us know that they delivered talks to the emperor. And today, I think, due to limited of time, I would go into the details of 3 lectures: Nishida's lectures, Rajaji's lecture, and Takahashi's lectures. Okay. So first, let's look into Nishida's lecture. Nishida received his the Order of Culture, Bunka Kunsho, in 1940, and 2 months after he received this order, the merit, he delivered a talk on to the emperor on the January 1941. This lecture is called on the philosophy of history, and it is divided into 2 parts. I think the first part is about what is philosophy, and the second part is what is history. So it is delivered just before the Pearl Harbor attack. So Nishida, of course, like other guys in Japan, had no idea that Japan is on the way to the Pacific War. But Nishida is trying to give the emperor a lesson on what is philosophy, and then what is the actually more important here is the kind of historical mission of Japan. And this talk is actually quite well known to the English-speaking academia because it is already translated by Yusa Michiko sensei in her work Zen and Philosophy, an Intellectual Biography of Nishida Kitaro, published in 2002. So this text is available. For the first part, as I mentioned, it is about what is philosophy. So Nishida gave a quick introduction of, philosophy is supposed to be about a kind of unified discipline. But of course, the emperor had no idea of what is talking about, what's going on here. So Nishida had a strategy. He would like to introduce this topic of biology to the emperor because the emperor knows something about biology. So Nishida quickly came to his later philosophy of life, or in Japanese, lexitic seimei, kind of historical life, which is an important concept in later Nishida. So in later Nishida's philosophy, he argued that his philosophy is similar to one of his contemporary biologists, namely J.S. Haldane. J.S. Holding wrote a book called The Philosophical Basis of Biology, and Nishida quotes this work a lot in his later work. And of course, he did not mention Holding in his talk to the emperor, but the basic idea is there. So what is important about biology is not about the study of dead samples in the laboratory. Biology is the study of how the body can interact with the environment. So it has no point to do an anatomical studies in the lab. Biologists should see how organisms and environment interact with each other. So that is the basic concept of this so-called biological historical life. And from this kind of concept, he further developed these ideas of point that biological life is essentially historical. So it is not just about looking into the biological setting, but we need to understand there is a kind of historical dimension in life. And then he shifted his topics to the philosophy of history, because that is the topic of this talk. History, according to Nishida, is here, is almost like a mirror of what is happening in biological life. So in life we have smaller organisms grouped together and become a bigger organism. So history is more or less the same. So according to Nishida, all this historical world begins with a certain ethnic group of people, and then later we have different group of people dwell at various places and create their own cultures. And this is important. Nishida now developed the kind of, I hate this, but that is Nishida's ideas, a kind of globalization theory about we have a rapidly changing world. While we can have all this new kind of transportation, and the world is becoming smaller and smaller. So there is a chance that a kind of global world, or in Japanese very weird, sekai deku sekai, so it's a globally world, is now formed. And with a limited, maybe in German we have to read this with Lebensraum, so with a limited space for living. Now we have a problem of how these ethnic groups can coexist, and that is becoming dangerous. Now you can feel that we all notice that this kind of historical theory will lead to a kind of organic kind of thought, and Nishida tried to avoid that. I'm not sure if he is successful, but at the same time, if there's not enough environment for all these ethnic groups, there will be struggles and conflicts, and wars are inevitable. Almost sounds like social Darwinism. So Nishida, perhaps in a kind of wishful thinking, suggests that all these groups should sympathize, united together, and become a kind of greater development of human culture. So this is the kind of talk that we can feel that something could be dangerous to us nowadays, but perhaps that is the kind of the lecture that the emperor will be glad to hear. And to continue, Nishida also mentioned this problem of Kokasugi. Because in Kokasugi, sometimes it just narrowed down to one nation. So Nishida tried to avoid that kind of narrow nationalism and to argue that Japan should develop into a more globalized way to deal with nationalism. That is Nishida's project. And Nishida, as a kind of liberal philosopher, also tried to avoid this problem of Zentai Shugi, or in Japanese or in English, totalitarian kind of thinking. So in Japan, maybe there are some discussion about all this Zentai Shugi, and Nishida is very aware of this problem, and he is trying his best to let the emperor know that Japan should avoid one-sided Zentai Shugi and to respect the individuality of every single person. So that is Nishida's ideas. So he had a very difficult position. There's not much he can argue very clearly, but in a certain sense, he tried to still be a liberal philosopher in promoting a kind of individualism to avoid a radical Zentai Shugi. However, it comes to the disappointment, because at the end of the lecture, Nishida had to mention the historical mission of Japan, and now he suddenly, from a kind of liberal scholar, and then become a kind of right-wing scholar. Now he suddenly, in the very last paragraph of this talk, he realized, okay, let's talk about the royal family, the imperial family, and the emperor suddenly, I think, knows what Nishida is trying to say, right? So, in all these difficult times, now the history has unfolded with the imperial family as its center. So that is the kind of message I think that will turn up to be almost like the later propaganda of Hakoichu, and of course this later project of the greater East Asia conspiratory sphere. So that is the kind of the talk delivered by Nishida. So the talk was has a lot of problem, but this is written just before the Pearl Harbor attack. So Nishida, we didn't realize that the situation was getting worse and worse after that. But as a philosopher, he was trying his best, I guess, to deliver some kind of political message. The state is going into that kind of direction, but at least it should not go into an extreme totalitarian kind of way. That is, I think, the summary of Nishida's talk. So next, let's see. 2 years later, we have Rajaji's talk. And talking about Rajaji, it is quite interesting to see that he is not presenting the talk under the same category as Nishida, the kind of Western text category. Rajaji gave this talk under this category of kokusho, the Japanese books. And he's not mentioning any kind of modern thinker. So Rajaji is one of the pioneer of introducing Western philosophy into Japan. He's an expert of Nietzsche, Schiller, Kierkegaard, but he mentioned nothing about this Western philosophy. But he chose the topic, the poetics of Shinke. So who is Shinke? Shinke is a monk who has all this, reputation of writing kind of a Lingka. So what is Lingka? Lingka, what is the meaning? It is of two characters, the lang and ga. Lang means linked, ga means the poems. So Rajajis is giving a talk about Shinke, but it is not just about Shinke, because Shinke is a guy who writes poems with other colleagues. So it's a kind of co-authorship, or kind of, in recent terms, kind of collective kind of art creation, not with just a single signature. But Lingka Long is somehow, to me, a kind of surprise why this philosopher is working on this Lingka poetics. So I read this text by Rajaji, and I had one remark. In this talk, Rajaji mentioned nothing about Lingka, without a single example of Lingka. So I need to look for a good example of Lingka to illustrate what is going on here. And this is the example I find. Shinke, in one of his famous Lingka, wrote a poem in response to Ninze. So Ninze wrote something like this: Shimono furu magai ni tsuyu ga kienu nan. That is the first poem. And then the second poem reads Hamagaze Samushi Sumino Enotsuki. So this is my humble English translation. Frost falling. Yesterday I think hail was falling, right? In Brussels. Dew vanishes from sight. So you can feel that there is the setting of a cold weather. The dews are actually disappeared. That means that there could be a kind of windy kind of weather. So cold and windy, it's like today in Brussels. So after we have the first poem, Shinke is writing the second poems in responding to the first. So cold sea breeze blows and the moon appears. I was in Bruges 2 days ago. It's like cold wind almost blow me out from the station. So,
did you see the moon?
No, I was there in the daytime. Yeah.
That's one thing we don't have.
The sun disappeared. Yeah.
Yes.
And what is so special about this Lingka, and as a scholar, as a philosopher, why he is giving this kind of lecture to the emperor? For what reason? And I think the reason is clear, because Rajaji, as a very clever intellectual, he was trying to deliver a strong political message to the emperor, as usual. And because we know that Rajaji at that time had just published the second volume of the Ethics, so it's like trying to promote something like the state is the top, the most important Jinlindexoski. So it's like the cyclical kind of organization. But at the same time, we should not forget Rajaji, who was a kind of liberal intellectual when he was younger. He published this work, Koji Junle, The Pilgrimage to the Asian Temples in Nara. In that book, he criticized the state's policy of using Shintoism as the state religion. So when he visited Nara in the 1990s, he discovered this Buddhist town was a ruin. He used the word haiko, a ruin. So now when we go to Nara, it's like, okay, wow, it is like just like Tang Junyi, we say, okay, this is how Japan preserved Chinese culture. But during the time of the younger Rajaji, it was a kind of destroyed by their own people. So Rajaji had this reputation of criticizing the state policies, and later he tried to support that. This is the moment that he's trying to support the state policy in the ethics. But in the lecture, I would like to argue that there is a rather subtle message that Japan should learn from this kind of poetics. And what is here, the poetics actually is important. What is the message here? So we can see, one moment. So the point is here, Lingka is like a kind of a collective creation. So it has to be written by two artists, as the case here. There are two artists, the two poets. Rajaji actually mentioned the example of architecture. For example, in Bruges, I visited this Salvator Cathedral, which is usually regarded as an architect designed by one architect. So there's not much to respect the other carpenters or other builders who were involved in the building of the cathedral. So Rajaji realized one thing: in Western culture, all these collective art were somehow united under the name of one single artist. And he also mentioned the case of Western literature, like, for example, Homer's Odyssey, which is apparently with a couple of authors involved in the making. But somehow we only acknowledge Homer as the sole creator. But in Lingka, in this Japanese typical way of doing the poems, there is a kind of respect of a kind of co-authorship. So what will be the kind of manner or the kind of practice of for example, for the second poet to read or to deal with the first poem? There is a basic manner of trying to open the possibility of understanding the experience or the feelings of the first poem. So the second poet, for example, here in the case of Shinke, he had to pay fully respect to the first poet. So Shinke used a specific term to describe this feeling of respect. That is to break your heart. Kokoro wo kotaku. So what is meant by this kind of breaking your heart, or to dissolve oneself? I would translate as dissolve oneself into the first poem. That is to make sure that you are not showing too much about yourself. That is, before you write your own poems, usually you try to be creative and you try to show off your poetic, creativity. But according to Rajaji, if you are a kind of Lingka poet, you need to pay full respect to the first poem. So there are other specific messages quoted, written by Shinke and quoted by Rajaji. For example, you need to break your heart, literally, to respect the first poem, or you need to, we call it this funkotsu, that means to almost like emptying your mind to understand the first poem. Or talking about techniques, if you want to show off your techniques in your own poems without paying any respect to the first one, this Lingka has no value. So that is the kind of thought that Shinke mentions in his work, and Rajaji quoted these kind of words. So you cannot just try to entertain people with your own techniques or your own kind of wisdom. You always like to open yourself to the body. You need to throw away yourself and to throw away yourself, it seems that you don't have any kind of character. But Rajaji or Shinke actually argues that the real character will show off if you break yourself, if you are emptying yourself. So this is the kind of theory mentioned by Shinke, and that is the point that I would like to argue. And Rajaji here would like to suggest that one should not blindly follow the other. Precisely speaking, if you associate flower to plum or cherry blossom, it will be agreed by all. Manza doshin. So everyone will agree that if you write something about flower, you talk about sakura or ume, good, but not the best. It usually shows some kind of respect, but not deep enough. But you cannot be too creative. So you have this kind of in between kind of wisdom to not just following the other, but not to be too creative.
Is this a quote from the talk he gave to the emperor?
Yeah. These are the This is Rajaji's own words. Yeah. So Rajaji actually 5 minutes. Actually developed these ideas into these two distinction of two types of Lingka, namely I will translate as the closed poems. Shinku is not Oya, but Shinku. That means the two poems are quite similar to each other. So if you write a poem just blindly respecting the first poem, which is we can feel that you repay some kind of respect, but it is not good enough. So the better kind of poem would be the soku. That is I would translate as the distant poems. So the two poems seemingly have no connection to each other, but they are somehow connected distantly, connected kind of subtly. So the best Lingka is not, of course, the close poems, but the distant poems. That is one kind of teaching from Shinke. That is Anadu Samani Zenagi Kitaru Mono. These poems should be connected not too closely, but kind of almost connected by nothing. And also in some kinds of Buddhist terms, the close poems are like the Sanimitta, and the distant poems are like the Animittas. So it's the kind of poems here is like one is like the close poems are like the Confucian teachings. So they are trying to bring some kind of family similarities. But the distant poems should be like Zen, that is Rajaji's teaching. And Rajaji also mentioned the kind of Confucian aspect in these kind of poetics. And because he realized that Shinke actually quotes the Analects, a specific passage, I think this is quite creative. The superior man is Catholic and not partisan, and the main man is partisan and not Catholic. In Catholic setting here today, I hope.
This is actually Freemason.
The other one, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I hope this is a kind of lecture that Rajaji delivered. So what is the message here? Rajaji really want to argue that this is not just the way of poetics. This is the way of human relationship. So as a human being, you should not be a kind of poet who just trying to look for the apparent similarities, but you need to also show your own personality and not ruining the personality of the other. That is the kind of teaching, a very subtle kind of message to the emperor. Japan should not just look for apparent, similarity of the other, but you need to respect the other and keep your own, creativity. So time is running out. Let's go to the third lecture I would like to share with you today. That is a lecture on Takahashi Satomi's, lecture on love. So after all these lectures, or kind of a ningen kanke, right, in Rajaji's sense, I think nothing could avoid Japan to go into this, situation of actually not loving the other, not dealing with the other with love or friendship. So Takahashi Satomi, as a philosopher, strongly influenced by Max Scheler. He delivered a talk in 1956. That is almost like 10 years after the war, and the topic of his talk was the forms of love as the basic motivation of culture. So in his talk, I think I would just I'm not reading the paper now. I'll go through it quickly. So he gave the 5 notions of love to the emperor. And the first one, eros, agape. These are well-known notions of love. The first appears in Phaedrus and Symposium. The second one, agape, is important notion of love in Christianity. And he argues that Nishida trying to unite the two loves together, and it happens in Nishida, of course. But Takahashi believes that all these love are not enough. So there should be a kind of love that unites all different kinds of love together, and including the 5th one, friendship. So love should be a kind of all-embracing, all-encompassing kind of activities. It is almost like an unconditional love without any kind of conditions to love a specific group, but you need to love not just one specific group, but also the other. Or you should also love something like as a kind of agape. You should also love those who are not privileged. So that is the kind of lecture, extremely important. And Takahashi Satomi, as I mentioned, was influenced by Max Scheler. So he argues that love in a kind of Schelerian sense in the word Einfühlung. So Einfühlung is usually translated as Itaigang. So it's like two bodies are feeling as if they are one. So it is no longer a kind of a separation of two bodies, but as in the case of cultural entanglement, these katto, these two plants are actually surviving, existing together as one. So this is a kind of, again, a kind of message that Takahashi Satomi really want to develop. And in Takahashi's words, sometimes we may need to emphasize on eros, and sometimes we may need to emphasize on agape or philia. But all we need to do is to develop the kind of love. And he argues that Japanese culture is actually has the essence of, for example, harmony. Harmony, in other words, would be this kind of all-embracing love. That is, I think, the main points of Takahashi's lecture. And why it is important here? Because in Japan, love is somehow not realized in the terms of all this kind of, all-embracing kind of love. We can still find that some kind of people are not loved by, for example, the Japanese, such as the Chinese Koreans, the Okinawan people, the Ainu people, the victims of Hiroshima, Nagasaki, or Fukushima, blah, blah, blah. That will be all the neighborhoods in East Asia. In Japan, there's not enough kind of love shown to all these kind of people. So Takahashi is trying to give the emperor a lecture on love, and I have to say again, we can find a really strong political message here. And now comes to the conclusion. So a very quick conclusion. So my conclusion will be something like this. Yeah. So we have just mentioned 3 lectures by 3 philosophers, and what can we learn from them? In my opinion, it is not only to understand what they said, obviously, but also what they did not or could not say. In other words, these talks are in these examples of an entangled philosophy between philosophy and politics, between philosophy and literature, and between, for example, philosophy and love. Because philosophy usually is a tetsugaku, but love, philosophia is not a gaku. So between philosophy and tetsugaku. To push a little bit further, it is about the impossibility to have a philosophy without politics, a philosophy without literature or world literature, or a philosophy without love. If I can make a claim about one fact about 20th century philosophy, it is a philosophy of many selves from East Asia, as well as many others that actually define the selves. If this is the case, we can no longer use the word 20th century frameworks of the East versus the West, or the East Asian versus the rest of the world. All these cultural traditions are indeed entangled, and the self is always related to the other. Another thing we should learn from this lecture is to learn from their failure to include the other. We can notice that there's actually the absence of philosophy in recent lectures for more than 20 years. And the absence of influential philosophers such as Tanabe Hajime, Miki Kiyoshi, of course, he passed away in jail, and also all kind of left-wing thinkers. So if it is not included in the lecture series, we should include them in our own lecture series. And although there are speakers from the Seoul Teikoku Daikoku, the King Jingshung Daijō, and the Taiwan Imperial University, there was an absence of non-Japanese speakers. And one exception, it will be taught by Kindaichi Kyosuke on Ainu language. But there was not even one single lecture on Korean philosophy or Taiwanese philosophy. And of course, it's easy to, we can notice that there was not a single lecture by a women scholar or on any women philosophers. So top scholars in Japan used to deliver lectures to the emperor, of course to other imperial family members. Now it is time for us to open the lectures to everyone. Need that to say we should include the above mentioned neglected topics, and then we should have a better gender balance. Eventually, I hope we can deliver lectures not only to the privileged, the emperor, but also to everyone, including children. In this sense, we will no longer be doing just Tetsugaku, but we should be doing Kitetsu. Last but not least, this talk sums my personal kato of doing philosophy in a Japanese department and doing Japanese in a philosophy department. Thank you for your attention.